The fifth time my husband announced to a room full of his colleagues that marrying me had cost him his best years. Our 9-year-old son Finn was sitting close enough to reach under the table and squeeze my hand. He did. That's the thing I remember most from that night. Not what Ryan said, not the way his boss laughed, not the way my mother-in-law tilted her head like she'd been waiting for it. I remember the small, warm weight of my son's hand finding mine, and the way Finn looked up at me like he already understood something I'd spent 4 years refusing to name. Ryan had just been promoted to regional vice president at Meridian Financial Group. We were celebrating at our house, a detail that would turn out to matter enormously, with 14 of his closest colleagues, his boss Clark, his mother Gloria, his sister Courtney, and her husband. I had spent 3 days preparing for that dinner. 2 grocery runs because Ryan had preferences about where the salmon came from. A borrowed folding table because we didn't have enough seating, and Ryan had told me, approximately 6 hours before guests arrived, that he'd also invited his direct reports. I found 2 extra chairs, of course I did. That same morning, I had picked up his navy suit from the dry cleaner, confirmed the centerpiece with the florist, called Finn's pediatrician to reschedule an appointment I'd double-booked, and checked the parking situations because Ryan always liked to know if he should mention valet. I did all of that before 9 a.m. Ryan came home at 6:45, looked at the table I'd set, and said, "Did we get the good wine?" I pointed to the rack. "The one I texted you about?" Sonoma Coast Pinot, second shelf. His shoulders dropped in relief the way they always did when something he'd assigned to my brain had been correctly executed. He kissed my cheek. "You really keep this whole operation running," he said, already heading to the bedroom to change. I remember thinking, even then, he means that as a compliment. Dinner went well in the way that dinners go well when someone has worked very hard to make sure they do. I refilled glasses before anyone asked. I caught Gloria before she reached the shrimp appetizer and reminded her, quietly, that her cardiologist had flagged shellfish. She waved me off but didn't take any. When Courtney arrived with her youngest, unannounced, I found a spare chair and kept the conversation from stalling. I handled things. I always handled things. Finn sat beside me. He'd asked to stay up for the party, and I'd said yes, mostly because I wanted him close without knowing why. Clark raised his glass around 40 minutes in. He talked about Ryan's numbers, his leadership, his relentless drive. Ryan smiled the way he smiles when he's being watched, easily, like everything has always been this effortless. Clark said, "The sky is genuinely the limit for this guy." That's when Ryan leaned back, wine loose in his hand, and said, "Honestly, if I'd stayed single until 40, I'd probably own half of Nashville by now." People laughed. Someone said, "Still time." Ryan grinned. "Too late for that." He looked across the table at me. "Right, Lee?" I smiled. I have spent years training myself to smile at exactly that moment. "He gave up his freedom way too young," Gloria said, patting Ryan's arm, and the table laughed again. Finn stopped eating. I felt it more than I saw it. The stillness that settled over the small body beside me. I put my hand on his arm. He didn't look at me. He was looking at his father with an expression no 9-year-old should have to organize on their own face. Ryan hadn't noticed. He was already talking again, and Clark was refilling his glass, and the moment passed the way those moments always passed. Quickly, painlessly, with me absorbing the impact the way a wall absorbs sound. After the guests left, after I'd stacked dishes and wiped counters and walked Gloria to her car, after Finn had gone upstairs and Ryan had settled into the armchair with the last of the Pinot looking satisfied with his life, I sat across from him. "That's the 5th time," I said. He looked up. "What?" "You've told people that marrying me was a mistake. Tonight was the 5th time." He set down his glass. "Lay, come on, it's a running joke." Finn was sitting right there. A pause, something moved across his face too quickly to read. "He's 9, he doesn't." He stopped eating. Ryan looked at the coffee table. "You're making this into something it isn't." That phrase. I had heard that phrase so many times that I could predict the syllables before they landed. You're making this into something it isn't. You know I don't mean it. Everyone knows I'm joking. Can we not do this tonight? What Ryan didn't know, what Ryan had never once thought to wonder about, was that I had been keeping records. Not out of strategy, out of instinct. The same instinct that made me hold on to the receipt when I paid for Gloria's physical therapy out of my own savings, because her Medicare supplement didn't cover the full course her doctor recommended. The same instinct that kept every tax document, every insurance renewal, every school form, every medical record in labeled folders in the home office Ryan never entered. I kept records because I was the only one who understood how much there was to track, and some quiet part of me had always known that day would come when it mattered. I had stopped working when Finn was born, which sounds simple but isn't. Before that, I was a marketing manager at a regional agency in Charlotte. Ryan and I had talked about it, or had what we called talking about it. Finn was 3 months old. Ryan was being relocated to Nashville for a promotion, and his travel schedule had already become unworkable with 2 people in demanding jobs. Ryan said, "What if you took a year, just to get us settled?" I took a year. The year became 2. Then Gloria had a minor cardiac event and needed someone coordinating her recovery. Then Courtney's marriage fell apart and she needed help with school pickups. Then Ryan was up for another promotion and said, carefully, that he needed to be able to focus. I said, okay. The years kept going. I never resented the work. I resented, eventually, the invisibility of it. Ryan paid the mortgage and the utilities and the car payments. I managed everything else. Partly from the inheritance my grandmother left me, money I deposited into our joint account without making a point of it. I covered Finn's dental bills when the insurance ran short. I paid the deductible when Ryan needed an emergency root canal, and the FSA was empty. I sent birthday gifts to Ryan's clients, because he'd mentioned once that personal touches mattered in financial services. And after that, it simply became something that happened. The way weather happens. I did those things because I wanted our life to work, because I loved my family, and because I had made the mistake of doing it all so quietly that everyone involved had started to believe it happened on its own. The morning after the dinner party, Finn came to the kitchen and sat at the counter and watched me make his breakfast. He had Ryan's habit of pausing before he says something important. "Dad does that a lot," he said. I didn't pretend not to know what he meant. "Does it bother you?" I asked. He thought about it seriously. "It bothers me that it bothers you, and you pretend it doesn't." 9 years old. I slid his plate across the counter. I said, "Eat before it gets cold." But something in my chest had shifted the way ice shifts in a glass. Not breaking, just rearranging itself around a new truth. 2 days later, I called an attorney. Her name was Ms. Caldwell. She was around 50, precise in a way that felt like competence rather than coldness. She asked me direct questions and wrote down my answers without blinking. I had expected to cry. I didn't. "What brings you in?" she asked. I told her about the dinner, then the 4 times before it, then the real reason I was there. 3 nights earlier, I had come downstairs at 11 for a glass of water and stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Ryan was in his home office, door half open. I heard his voice first. "She has no idea," he was saying. A woman's voice through the speaker, too low to make out words. Ryan laughed, the specific laugh he uses when he feels safe. "She thinks I'm carrying us." A pause. "She's not going anywhere," he said. "She wouldn't know where to start." I went back upstairs. I lay in the dark and listened to Ryan come to bed an hour later and fall asleep easily, the way he always did, and I thought about every version of that sentence. She wouldn't know where to start. The version of me he had built in his own head and apparently shared with someone else. A dependent woman, a woman without options, a woman who needed him to stay. He had told this story about me to someone. I had no idea how long he'd believed it himself. I opened the drawer in my nightstand and took out a folder I'd put there 6 months ago, after Ryan mentioned during an argument about holiday plans that this is my house too. He'd said it, reflexively, the way you'd state something that was simply true. And I had realized he had never actually looked at the deed. The house on Crestwood Lane had belonged to my grandmother. She left it to me when she died, 2 years before I met Ryan. It was paid off. My grandmother had been a practical woman who believed her granddaughter should have something that couldn't be taken. When Ryan and I got married, we moved in. He paid the property taxes and some maintenance from our joint account. He called it our house so naturally, so genuinely, that I think he had simply rewritten the history in his mind and forgotten there was another version. The deed had one name on it. Mine. Ms. Caldwell reviewed the paperwork without expression. Then she looked up at me and said, "Your husband is going to have some surprises." I went home. I didn't pack Ryan's things. I didn't call Gloria. I made a list instead. Every appointment, every system, every invisible structure I maintained that kept our household functioning. I looked at that list for a long time. Then I started crossing things off. Not Finn's needs, nothing that would hurt our finances or harm our son. Just the work I had taken on because no one else would, and no one had ever asked me to stop. That week, Ryan texted to ask if I'd rescheduled his dental cleaning. I hadn't. He called to ask me to call them. I said, "It's your dentist, Ryan." Silence then. "You always handle that." I know. "So why haven't you?" "Because I don't anymore." Another pause, then predictably, "Is this about the dinner?" "No," I said. "The dinner was the last thing. This is about everything before it." When I told Courtney I wasn't available to pick up her kids Thursday, she called back in under 5 minutes. I told her Ryan had offered without checking with me. She hung up. Ryan called 20 minutes later. "Don't drag Courtney into this," he said. I didn't. I just said I wasn't available. The disruption comes from people who'd forgotten I had the option of saying that. "Lee, this is petty." "Okay," I said and ended the call. My hands shook for 10 minutes after, not from anger, from the unfamiliar feeling of having said a true thing and not walked it back. The weeks that followed were quiet in the specific way things get quiet before they get loud. Ryan's quarterly client dinner fell apart when the reservation he'd mentioned to me in passing, but never asked me to confirm, was released by the restaurant. He called me furious. I told him I hadn't known he wanted me to handle it. He said I always handled it. I said not anymore. He moved the dinner to a hotel bar at the last minute. His colleague Adrian, who had apparently been helping fill the gap my absence left, asked him why he didn't have an assistant for this kind of logistics. Ryan told her I usually did it. Adrian said, "I thought you said she didn't work." I know this because Courtney told me, 2 weeks later in a moment of misdirected irritation. She wasn't trying to help me. She was annoyed with Adrian for asking the question. But I sat with it for a long time. The version of me Ryan had apparently described to a woman he worked closely with, a woman who didn't work, a woman with nothing better to do. Gloria called on a Tuesday, her voice carrying the particular edge of someone who has waited too long for a thing they expected. "I waited for your reminder," she said. "I know. I'm sorry that caused confusion." "You always call to confirm my cardiology appointments." "I did. For 3 years, I kept my voice even. I won't be doing that going forward." Silence. Then, "Is this because of what Ryan said at the dinner?" "Partly." I paused. "Gloria, I sat in the ER alone with Finn at 2 in the morning while Ryan was at a business dinner. I organized your husband's memorial service so that Ryan could grieve without having to think about flowers and catering. I paid for your in-home recovery care out of my own savings, when Medicare didn't cover the full schedule your surgeon recommended." Quiet on the line. "I didn't do any of that to earn something," I said. "I did it because I loved this family. But your son has spent 4 years telling rooms full of people that I was a mistake, and the last time he did it, Finn heard him." A long pause. "Finn heard him," she said. He held my hand under the table. Neither of us spoke for a moment. "He's 9, Gloria said finally. "I know." Ryan got the divorce papers on a Wednesday afternoon. He called me 11 times. I answered on the 12th. "What is this?" he said. Not a question. "You can read." "Lee." His voice was different now, scraped clean of patience. "We have a son." I know we do. My attorney knows we do. You went and hired an attorney without. I've been talking to you about this for 4 years, Ryan. You called it a joke every time. I called it a pattern. I let that sit. We can call it whatever we want now. My attorney will handle the terminology. You can't take the house. There it was. I'm not taking anything, I said. The house has been mine since before I met you. We have lived there for 9 years. We have. The deed still has one name on it. He went quiet in the way people go quiet when they're suddenly doing math they don't like. Tennessee is an equitable distribution state. I know, my attorney knows too. He hung up. He called his mother. She and Courtney arrived at my door at 7 that evening. I let them in because it was March and cold, and because, despite everything, I had spent 9 years caring about these women, and that didn't disappear because a marriage was ending. Courtney said, "You can't do this." I asked, which part? All of it, the divorce. Cutting everyone off, the house. I haven't cut anyone off. I've stopped doing things I was never asked to do in the first place. Gloria sat down, her hands folded tight. She looked older than she had 6 months ago, or maybe I was just seeing her differently now. Ryan has lived in that house for 9 years, Lee. He has. His name was never added to the deed. My grandmother left it to me 2 years before Ryan and I met. Courtney said, he pays the property taxes. From our joint account, which I also funded. You haven't had a paycheck in years. I haven't had a salary, I said. That's different. I went to the hallway desk and came back with a binder. I set it on the coffee table in front of Gloria. She looked at it like it might be something she didn't want to open. 9 years of financial records, I said. Finn's orthodontist bills when the dental insurance had a gap. Your in-home care after your hip replacement, Gloria? I covered 3 weeks out of pocket because Medicare only approved 2. Courtney, the kids' summer day camp after your divorce, because Ryan wanted to help and I made it happen and no one mentioned it again. I paused. The property taxes Ryan paid came from an account we both contributed to. A portion of my contributions came from an inheritance my grandmother left me. Gloria's hands had gone still on the binder. I didn't do any of this to build a case, I said. I did it because it needed doing and I was there. But the story your son has been telling, about carrying this family alone, about me being a weight on his potential, that story has never been true. And I have the documentation to say so. Courtney said very quietly, I didn't know he'd said it 5 times. I know you didn't. The mediation was 6 weeks later. Ryan's attorney, a polished man named Mr. Vickers, opened by establishing that Ryan had been the primary wage earner throughout the marriage. He was factually correct. He was also incomplete. Miss Caldwell placed my binder on the table and opened it without ceremony. The investment account distributions I'd drawn on over the years, the household contributions that had never appeared in Ryan's income column because they'd come from money he didn't know to count. The premarital property documentation. At one point, Ryan looked across the table at me and said, "Why didn't you ever tell me how much you were putting in?" Ms. Caldwell's hand rested lightly on my arm. Not a warning, something more like acknowledgement. I told you every time, I said. You said thank you and moved on. He looked at the table. That's not an accusation, I said. It's what happened. You were grateful the way you're grateful for good weather. You noticed it, and then you forgot it was something that required a source. He didn't answer. I let that happen, I said. That's on me too, but I'm not going to carry it forward. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday. I signed the last form in Ms. Caldwell's office and drove home through Nashville in early April light. The city bright and indifferent the way cities are when your personal life resolves itself quietly. The house was still when I got there. Finn was at school. I walked through the rooms slowly. The kitchen where I'd made 10,000 breakfasts, the living room where I'd sat through 4 years of dinner parties, the home office where I kept all the folders Ryan had never looked at, and the walls were exactly the same as they'd always been. On the kitchen counter, Finn had left me a note before school. He'd been doing that lately, leaving small notes I hadn't asked for, and he never explained. This one said, "What do you want for dinner? Also, I'm really proud of you." I stood there for a moment and laughed, which I hadn't done easily in longer than I could account for. My best friend Britt came over that evening with Thai food, and the particular quality of quiet that good friends know how to bring. We sat at the kitchen table, and she asked how I was feeling. "Lighter," I said, and scared in that order. "Both make sense," she said. I had started taking freelance marketing projects 2 months earlier, quietly, after a former colleague reached out about a contract. I'd said yes before I finished reading the email. The work was slow to build, but it was building. My first recurring client needed someone who could manage multiple stakeholders, coordinate across departments, and stay organized under pressure. I told her, somewhat dryly, that I had 9 years of field experience in all 3 areas. She hired me that week. Britt raised her glass. "To being paid for something you're actually good at." I raised mine, to it counting. Ryan, for his part, moved into an apartment in East Nashville about 15 minutes away. Close enough for Finn, far enough for me. He was learning things over there. He'd called in the first month to ask why his health insurance claims were being rejected. He hadn't updated his primary care physician with the new address after the move. He figured it out himself after a while. He was getting better at figuring things out himself. Finn came back from his first full weekend at Ryan's looking the specific kind of tired that children look when they've spent 2 days managing adults. He dropped his backpack by the door and said, "Dad forgot groceries." "Did you eat?" He ordered from the Thai place on 5th. A pause. He didn't know about my peanut allergy. I stayed very still. "I had to tell the delivery app myself," Finn said. He pulled off his shoes. "He said he thought you always just knew." "I did know," I said. Finn looked up at me. He had the expression of someone assembling something complicated. He thought it was just in the house, like the information was just there. "It was," I said, in my head. Finn nodded once and went upstairs. I stood in the kitchen alone, thinking about all the things that had lived only in my head. Allergy protocols, prescription refill schedules, the exact configuration of Finn's sports bag, the name of his homeroom teacher's classroom aide, the way Gloria liked her coffee, the extension number for Ryan's office, because he sometimes forgot it himself. Information that had seemed like nothing, because it had never been absent. That spring, I took on 2 more freelance clients. Britt and I started talking seriously about formalizing something. A small consulting firm, marketing strategy, and operations for businesses that needed systems as much as they needed stories. She had connections. I had the systems. We had both been told, in different ways and by different people, that the work we did best wasn't the impressive kind. We filed the paperwork in April. I typed my name into the Tennessee business registration form and looked at it for a moment before I submitted it. Not Ryan's wife, not Gloria's daughter-in-law, not Courtney's unpaid childcare solution. Just my name and the thing I was building with it. Finn found the paperwork on the kitchen counter that evening. He read it the way he reads everything, slowly, like he's looking for the part that matters. "You started a company?" he asked. "Britt and I are starting one together." "What kind?" "Marketing and operations. We help businesses get organized and communicate better." He thought about that. "That's basically what you did for Dad." "More or less." "For free." "For free," I agreed. He nodded, like something had been confirmed. Then, in the calm, certain tone he uses when something strikes him as simply obvious, "You should charge more." I laughed. "We're working on it." He picked up his backpack, stopped, turned back. "Mom." "Yeah." That night, the dinner, he looked at me steadily. "I'm glad you heard it." "I'm glad you were there," I said. He nodded once, the economy of motion he'd always had, and went upstairs. I stood in the kitchen of the house my grandmother had left me, in the city where I'd rebuilt something after years of believing that holding everything together was the same as having something of your own. It wasn't. One of those things kept other people standing. The other one was mine. I'd spent a long time confusing the two. I opened my laptop and pulled up the new client proposal I'd been drafting. Outside, Nashville was doing what it does in April. Sun through the windows. The kind of light that makes everything look like it's just starting. I had a meeting in the morning, a deliverable due Friday, and a 9-year-old who had left me a note that said he was proud of me before I'd done anything yet worth being proud of. I saved the document, closed the laptop, and started making dinner. For the first time in years, I was making it for someone who hadn't already decided it would just appear.